Good evening, everybody. It is February 21st, 2018. I am hearing reports that there are fish, yellow perch, starting to run in the rivers of the Chesapeake Bay. And so I thought I would spend a minute and talk about what I think are some of the most effective yellow perch presentations. To me, the number one yellow perch presentation, the one that, catches 80, 90, 95% of the fish that I catch, that my family catches every year, is the float and fly presentation. You take a small float. I prefer the weighted floats. You can see the lead on these floats. That gives it a little weight, allows you to cast lightweight lures. We need to take a small weighted float and put a small lightweight lure underneath it. Occasionally the fish are finicky and will want that lightweight lure tipped with live bait, either grass shrimp or live minnows. Many times, however, you do not need the live bait in order to catch the fish. If you've watched my jig tying tutorial that I posted last week, that I'm a huge fan of these crystal flash jigs. These are all handmade. They're not available anywhere that I'm aware of. Check out the tutorial for details on them. But these are 1/32 ounce jigs, simple ball head jigs, tied up with a material called crystal flash. You're going to tie these on light line, 6-pound mono for fluorocarbon, something in that range. 4-pound will even serve you fine. And put it under the float we just looked at. The situation will dictate the depth, but rarely would you need more than 3 feet of depth, or 4 feet at the maximum in the fishing that I've done, and rarely would you need less than 18 inches of depth. And the sweet spot is typically in between, but feel free to change your depth around. Depth can be very important with this style of fishing, and if you're not adjusting the depth between your bobber or float and your jig, you may be missing fish. I've seen people with just 12 inches more between their bobber and their jig catching fish, whereas somebody right next to them with 12 inches less wasn't, and vice versa. So it is important to think about depth with these lures and this presentation. One thing I will also add, I think one of the most effective aspects of these jigs is that they sink very slowly. They're lightweight and they sink slowly, and I think that sinking action is what makes them very effective. A huge percentage of the fish that you're going to catch in this presentation, or at least that I've caught with this presentation, hit on while the jig is falling after you've moved the cork or twitched the cork. And that slow falling action of these very lightweight jigs with this very lightweight dressing on them seems to be super effective. Well, we've talked a little bit about the floats that we use for this style of fishing when we're using the float and fly presentation for these yellow perch. We've talked a little bit about my favorite jig for this type of presentation, the crystal flash jig. And we're going to talk about some other lures here in a minute. But let's talk about the actual presentation, how you fish the float and fly. The basic concept is you cast out with the bobber and the jig underneath it at the appropriate depth, and you let the jig sink down when it lands on the water, and then you move the bobber back towards you during the retrieve in short movements of between either just an inch or two, which would be more like a twitch of the bobber, or maybe moving the bobber as much as 6 or 8 inches at a time.
And then as you move the bobber, what happens is that pulls the jig up in the water column. And then when you stop moving the bobber, the jig slowly sinks back to the full depth of the distance of line between the jig and the bobber. So you're essentially moving the bobber forward. It's lifting the jig up in the water column, and then the jig drops back down. The fish seem to really primarily hit on the fall when the jig is falling. So if you're just reeling in with this float and fly approach, you're going to be missing the opportunity to have that jig falling several times during the retrieve. If you're moving that float 4 or 5 or 6 inches, or even 1 or 2 inches, and then letting the jig sink back down, that's an opportunity for the jig to be falling, and that again is the primary kind of sweet spot for getting strikes in this approach. So, you just need to figure out every day is different. Sometimes what works at 10 in the morning will not work at 2 in the afternoon on the same day in the same spot. You just have to vary it. You have to see, is a little bit more up tempo, kind of twitch or jig and then sit, twitch, jig, sit kind of an approach work. Or sometimes you twitch it, you let it sit there, and the fish are only going to hit it after it sits there for a count or 2 or 3. And then the second you go to jig it again, that movement of that jig is what triggers the strike. So you just have to vary it, keep it mixed, and see what's working that day. But that's the basic style of presentation of the float and fly for these spawning yellow perch in the late winter and early spring in the rivers and creeks of the Chesapeake.
Now the presentation we're talking about is called the float and fly. And what we're looking at now are some real traditional float and fly style jigs that you can use with this presentation. They work very well. I tend to prefer the crystal flash, but there could be situations where you want true feather jigs like these that would be traditional float and fly jigs. These are 1/32 ounce jigs, and they're very small. Again, they have a very slow sink rate after the twitch, and again, I think that's an important attracting feature when we're fishing for these yellow perch on their spawning run. These are, I'm sure you'll recognize, shad darts. Now these shad darts, I'm going to show you with my finger here, are tiny. These are at least 1/32 ounce and possibly some of them might be 1/64 ounce shad darts. They're very small, and in my view, the really small shad darts tend to be the best option under this float and fly presentation for the spawning run yellow perch. And I like these size shad darts, although somewhat larger shad darts will catch fish and may be necessary depending on factors like wind, current, and so forth. But don't forget about the lowly shad dart. You'll recognize this as an assortment of trout magnets. They have 1/64 ounce shad dart style heads and then these split tail grub bodies. I have laid out here some of the colors that I think will be most effective on spring, early season yellow perch running up these rivers and creeks of the Chesapeake Bay. Working from left to right, the color is glow. Then we have plain white, white with chartreuse, straight chartreuse, and then chartreuse tipped with orange. I think these are all going to be effective colors. Again, the trout magnet has a very slow rate of sink. It's lightweight, and it has, I think, the possibility of being very effective under a float for these yellow perch, either by itself or tipped with a minnow or with grass shrimp. What we have here is a standard 1/16 ounce collar ball jig in a couple of variations of chartreuse. One has a little bit of orange and the other is just kind of a plain chartreuse with a kind of a paddle tail grub body. This particular version is called the Slabalicious by Mr. Crappy slash Strike King in chartreuse. I think it's called refrigerator white and chartreuse or something like that. This color has proved to be year in and year out the most effective color for us with this lure. You could fish this lure under a float, although typically if we're fishing this lure for early season yellow perch, we're probably fishing it without the float. It's conceivable you might even be able to move to a 1/32 ounce ball jig head with this style of presentation, although again, the 1/16 seems to catch the most fish. White is a good color, black is fine, chartreuse is the color I keep coming back to in terms of jig heads. With the bodies, I like this refrigerator white with chartreuse. Straight chartreuse is fine as well, and straight white is fine as well. You can also go with a curl tail grub as opposed to the paddle tail grub, although one school of thought is that the fish seem to perhaps be able to hone in on the paddle tail, the vibrations from the paddle tail in muddier conditions like you typically experience in the spring in these rivers and creeks of the Chesapeake Bay. Again, these are 2-inch grubs we're looking at. You could certainly fish 2.5 or possibly even 3-inch grubs without having the lure be too big for some of these fish. And if the water's really muddy, the bigger profile might be something the fish can see better. And if the water's clearer, you could probably go down to like a 1-inch grub or 1.5-inch grub and also have plenty of success. Although keep in mind, if you're casting this lure without a float, it's fairly lightweight. You're going to need ultralight tackle. And if you go to a very light tail, that's less weight for you to be casting. Although many of the places you're going to be fishing are not especially wide or deep in the headwaters of these rivers and creeks, so you can probably get away without having to cast it very far and still present the lure effectively.
So there you have it. That is 30 or 40 or 50 years worth of local knowledge on how to catch yellow perch most effectively during the spring spawning run in the late winter in the Chesapeake Bay or in the rivers and creeks of the Chesapeake Bay. Hey, if you go out there and you try it, don't keep these fish. They're a lot of fun, but throw them back. These fish they're in their spawning run. They need to be able to reproduce to make sure we have fish for the future. So certainly respect the creel limits. And if you do keep some fish, try to keep the males, the bucks. They'll have white milt coming out of them during their spawning period. And the bigger fish, especially the ones with the distended abdomens, are going to be females full of roe. Put those fish back in so we have future generations of yellow perch to enjoy for ourselves, for our children, for our grandchildren, and beyond. Thanks very much, and as always, it's the Brandywine Angler, Manly Parks. I really appreciate you watching.